Good afternoon, everyone. An introduction to ethics. This first lecture is going to be brief, but it is something I want to touch on so that you guys kind of have an understanding of a key distinction in Kant as we begin reading his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. And that distinction is between the a priori and the empirical. That distinction shows up in the first reading on pages 3 to 8, which is the preface to Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. And what I want to say about this distinction is it has to do with how one ought to do moral philosophy. That is to say, if we're searching for a standard by which to evaluate human action. If we're going to search for that standard, the question is, how should we go about locating that standard? How would we do so? We could do so through an empirical method. And by that, we could simply kind of observe human action and human behavior. We could just observe it. We could go out and, for example, I could go out and sit on a park bench and observe the different things that human beings do, observe the different actions they make, observe the different choices they make, and kind of come to some generalizations about what we think are the best choices that human beings ought to make. Um, but for Kant, ethics is about necessary and universal obligations that human beings have. Morality, in other words, is not contingent upon what human beings happen to do on a given day or in a given circumstance. That would be empirical. What human beings happen to do is empirical, based on observation. They might do one thing one day and another thing the next day, and that would simply be empirical. That would be an observation of human nature. In the introduction, Kant talks about practical anthropology. Now, anthropology does not necessarily mean the same thing today as it did in Kant's time, but anthropology is an empirical discipline. Most disciplines at the university, even today, are empirical. They rely upon observation of human behavior and trying to draw generalizations and conclusions and patterns based upon those observations. Political science, for example, is an empirical discipline. It observes, for example, one branch of political science is political behavior. It observes the way that people vote and the reasons that people vote the way that they do. And then we draw generalizations based upon what are statistically significant patterns. And so Kant is not convinced that the empirical domain, where we base our knowledge on observation and then we draw conclusions, he's not convinced that that is appropriate for moral philosophy, which is to say, locating a standard for our choices and for our action. Empirical observation will get us, at the most, um, it will give us generalizations about what people do and how people act. It will give us generalizations. It will never give us any kind of universal or necessary prescriptions for how people ought to act. And Kant is arguing that morality is about how people ought to act. And if it's about how we ought to act, we're not going to discover what that is by observing how we do act. Because, well, on the one hand, we could observe people doing really terrible things to each other. And we might conclude on that basis that there is no such thing as a moral standard. But that is only telling us how people are already acting. Just because they aren't doing good things doesn't mean that there isn't some moral standard that they ought to be following. And so, if morality is about ought or should, if it's about that uh, kind of modality of action as opposed to how we do act, if that's what it's about, then Kant argues we can only discover the standard a priori. We're not going to discover it empirically. And so to discover it a priori is to say that we can have knowledge about how human beings ought to act independent of uh, independent of human experience. So the a priori in Kant that language that comes up, and you'll see it, refers to knowledge that we can have independent of human experience. Independent. So Kant's argument is that to figure out what the moral standards are for human beings, we need to do an a priori investigation, separate from human experience. We cannot try and form some kind of generalization based upon simply observing human beings acting. That would be empirical. So it's this fundamental distinction between the a priori and the empirical that is fundamental to Kant's moral philosophy. It has to do, again, it refers to the method by which one is trying to determine what the standard of human conduct is. And that can only be done independent of our particular circumstances and our particular experiences. And this theme will come up again and again in Kant, but the general point is that Kant is trying to argue that morality cannot be contingent upon human circumstance and human experience. For Kant, morality offers necessary um, rules for conduct. They are requirements for everyone, regardless of their particular circumstances. The general intuition behind Kant's moral philosophy is that the same moral requirements that we expect others to follow, we should not exempt ourselves from. And so we often may find it necessary for other people to follow certain moral requirements, but maybe not ourselves. And so that's kind of the fundamental intuition that lies behind Kant. And so because we can't make exceptions for ourselves, that if we did make exceptions for ourselves, we would be arguing that morality does require us to look at individual circumstances. And we might say, well, your circumstances are such that, it's too hard for you to have to do what morality requires, and therefore we should exempt you. No, Kant is saying, regardless of your circumstances, morality's requirements exist. And so that's why when you say the metaphysics of morals, metaphysics is a branch in philosophy that tells us what is true beyond the physical. Um, and so in this case, if there's going to be a metaphysics of morals, it's going to be things that are true about morality beyond the physical, experiential realm of human beings. That doesn't mean supernatural, but it means that something that is metaphysically true and something that is true a priori is true independent of us. So morality's requirements are true independent of us. Kant thinks he can show in this book that he can discover the truths of morality independent of human experience. One of the things I often do to try to show this difference is to ask students, when you, um, and this you may not entirely agree with this, but try to see what your intuition is here. If somebody was to ask you, if you observed a drowning child, you were walking by one day by a body of water and you saw a young child drowning and you ran in to save the child. The question is, how would you know that that was the right thing to do? How did you know that? No, we're talking. So that's an epistemic question there. And Kant, and I think the argument at least would be, if you would say, well, I knew it empirically. Well, that would be saying that you needed to observe another instance of a drowning child in order to know that saving that child was the right thing to do. So it would be kind of like an inference from experience where you would say, well, I observed a bunch of cases of drowning children, and then I determined that that was the right thing to do. But before observing all of those cases, I wouldn't have known that. And I think, at least intuitively, that doesn't I don't think you'd be convinced by that. I think you'd say, no, I knew it was the right thing to do. You would say to me, It's just the right thing to do. That's what you would say. At least I think a lot of you would say that. I would say, how did you know that was the right thing to do? And you would say, it just is. When a child is drowning, you run in and save the child. And so that reaction, it just is, it's the right thing to do, we can say that we know that it's the right thing to do independent of experience. We can have that knowledge of what the right thing to do is. We don't need to have experience tell us what the right thing to do. We can know what it is a priori, which is to say independent of experience. And so this distinction between the empirical and a priori is fundamental to Kant. It's mentioned in the preface, and Kant speaks to it in the preference, in the preface. And I just want to read you one line from the preface that really speaks to this specific thing. He writes here at the bottom of page 4, going to the top of page 5, is it not thought to be of the utmost necessity to work out, for once, a pure moral philosophy, completely cleansed of everything that might in some way be empirical and belong to anthropology? So that's the crucial question. Pure there just means a priori. So that's what he's arguing, is that we can discover what morality requires of us independent of experience, a priori versus empirical. That's a crucial distinction. I just wanted to make sure you sort of took, if you take anything away from pages 3 through 8, that's what it should be.